thank you for those kind words, and I just want to join with everyone else in saying that this has been a great convocation. I want to thank everyone who's made it possible, Don, and all the people here at Luther Seminary, which is really come to mean like a community to me, a real spiritual learning community. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to be on this wonderful campus. Well, as I thought about this convocation and the sorts of things that you'd be learning, the kind of experiences we'd be going through together, I thought, well, we can't leave without thinking about an alternative way of understanding religion and science to the one that sort of the mainstream in our community. And that is this relatively recent move to make a public, loud statement that, science is the way forward, and to believe in science is to leave behind old superstitions like, leprechauns and Santa Claus and God. And so it goes by the name, I guess, of the new atheism. So my title is Religion Dangerous or Just Plain Stupid? Because it seems to me that that's almost the kind of idea you get by reading and listening to these things. Okay, that didn't work well.
Face this way. Face the projector, yeah.
Okay, it still doesn't do it. What? See, technology. Did it work? All right, good. And then went to 2. Okay. So this image, sorry about that. Technology, it's always getting in my way, but. So this image, I think, is one that sums it up in a certain way for me. So on the one hand, it's got that populist appeal, the beauty of the solar system as revealed by modern science and technology, in this case, the Hubble telescope, right? And look at this 404 error, which, of course, if you know computer science, that's a typical thing, But the error is God is not found. And so I'm thinking, well, that is kind of it. You got science, you've got computers, you don't need religion, there is no God, you're not going to find God. And then I thought about it for a minute and I go, you know what? That's also the basic problem with the new atheism, because they're trying to find God through a telescope. How basic an error is that? That's theology error 001. You can't find God through telescopes and microscopes. You're looking in the wrong place. You're not going to see God with your eyeballs. God's invisible. So, the new atheism, on the one hand, it seems like it's super academic, and very learned people that are engaged in and like science, technology, engineering are involved in this around the world, right? And making this sort of the evangelism for the new atheism, making it popular, putting it on the internet. There's been TV shows, podcasts, books. But on the other hand, there's this whole huge academic study of religion and theology that's older than modern science and been going on since the foundation of the universities in Europe, this academic theology that they kind of ignore. It's like, well, it's not an important subject, we don't study it. I keep wanting to say, read a book. Talk about God in an academic way if you're going to be academic about it. So, but my basic point today is that we need to take this movement seriously as Christians and consider our response. One example of that is if you look at the people who have been checking the new census box, no religion, we call them the nuns, I guess. And recently they've been doing surveys of this group. And one of the surveys returned the result that quite a large percent of the people in that group, they asked them, if you had a religion before, why did you leave it? And this was the answer, things like science and technology make religion obsolete, or, I don't think in the scientific age there's a need for God. Things like that have been the responses. So the message may seem somewhat simplistic when it comes to understanding of God. And the prophets and evangelists of the new atheism may seem that way. But on the other hand, they're making inroads among the elites of our culture, among the people that are sort of this core STEM teachers and learners and thinkers and researchers. This is a movement that needs to be taken seriously by the church today. So I believe that the first missionary activity is listening. You know, and it seems to me, and I hope that you would all agree with me, that to be a minister, to be a church leader, to be a member of a church that's in some kind of leadership is to be in mission. And so the first act of the missionary is to listen. So I think we should listen to these perspectives, we should read and understand them, and we should prepare our response. And that's basically the message that I want to suggest today. So it is a minority voice, though, atheism. If you look at people that do these religion surveys, the Pew Trust and other surveys, atheism, strictly speaking, is still a very minor percentage of American population. But the voice is a very powerful voice, and it's growing in significance. And so I do think that we owe it to the gospel and to our God to pay attention to this and think about how we might respond. Now, there's basically sort of, there's 4 horsemen in the book of Revelation, in the Apocalypse, right? So there's like these big 4 voices in the new atheism. There's Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. I like Christopher Hitchens' stuff, and I've read his things, but he's basically a journalist, so he says a lot of the same things, only he says it better. He's a better writer. He's able to communicate better than some of these other people. But I'm going to stick to the ones that have a little more academic moxie, I suppose. Not that Hutchinson, who's not with us anymore, alas, is not worth reading, but only that he doesn't say anything really distinctively different from the other 3. So we'll just go down with the Trinity and leave behind the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So there are some common themes. One is that religion is dangerous. One of the ways that this got started was this whole message thing got started. Richard Dawkins, who has a chair in the public understanding of science, that is, his chair is funded at Oxford to teach science to the larger culture. And he realized that, that this gives him a platform, though, to do things in popular media. So he went around and interviewed religious people around the world and talked to them about their thinking about science. And, of course, he picked out people who, not everybody, but the large number of people who represent some extreme views in religion. And it looked, in the interview like these people are pretty weird. They're not rational. They're not scientific. They don't accept the scientific views. And he put those together and the Channel 4 in Britain put them together as a series, right? Okay, so The Root of All Evil, ? Was the name of the television series. And then later that got changed into the book, The God Delusion, right? So Dawkins has this idea that he's been preaching regularly since then, since that series, that religion is dangerous, that faith is a virus, and it's bad for people. In fact, he's arguing that in a secular state, in a non-religious state, we shouldn't teach children religion. It should be forbidden that we actually teach children religion. He's so vehemently certain that religion is dangerous. So I need you to know that this is a view that a lot of people, not everyone is as extreme as Dawkins, but a lot of people accept the general tenor of this perspective, that religion is dangerous, irrational, unscientific, and probably fattening too. At least if you're Methodist, because we love potlucks. So the other answer is that atheism can make for happiness. That is, you can live a good life and be an atheist. And I actually think that's true. I come from families of atheists. I got loads of friends that don't believe in God and everything. And you can live a good life. You can work out an ethical system that gives you a humanistic ethic without God. I think that's true. Maybe this idea that we have had, that still exists in the church, maybe this idea that if you don't believe in God, then your ethics is suspect, atheism is dangerous, that's probably an idea we should try to get rid of in Christianity if we can. Because I don't believe it's true. I don't actually think atheism by itself is dangerous. So yeah, I like this. There's no religion. Thank God. Let's work for a world in which religion is gone, because it's a virus. It's a harmful, evil virus. So this is some of the common themes that you'll get. And here's a quote from Sam Harris, who's one of the he likes to make these extreme statements because then they get put on these memes and they go viral on the internet, and he's all about that. So he said this: I think religion's the most dangerous, divisive ideology we've ever produced. It is also the only ideology that is systematically protected from criticism, both from within and without. Now, the fact that this quotation is empirically false doesn't seem to bother anybody. I mean, Sam, you couldn't give your podcast, no one would buy your books if your criticism of religion was actually not protected in your society. But it's this ideology that religion is evil that people are buying into, I think. And so they don't want to be religious. Whatever else they might be, being religious is like the thing you don't want to be. So the Christian responses that I've noticed in the church, not all of them are very helpful. So one of them is sort of the ostrich response, right? Well, let's just ignore this whole movement and make fun of it like as much as we can on the side, and just kind of hope it will go away. But I don't think that's very effective. And I think we live in such a society that's so dominated by a love of technology and the prestige of science that we need to come up with some response here. We can't just pretend it's just a passing fad, like the Left Behind novels or something like that. You just ignore them and hope they'll go away. Well, guess what? That theology hasn't gone away. And I don't think this is going away either. If anything, in the next generation, I'm predicting, it could be false, that it will be more a part of American culture than it is now. And I think that we need to take this seriously. So it's not going to go away. We could go back into old positions. We could go on the attack with apologetics. And a place like Biola University has capitalized on this, and they have hundreds of young people that come there and study apologetics and Christian philosophy. I'm not sure that that's the most attractive approach in our culture. I'll come back to that topic again. It's not like I don't like apologetics or I don't think there aren't arguments for the existence of God, but that's sort of, I'm going to show you why on rational grounds you're wrong. I'm not sure that's an effective way to reach people for Jesus Christ. It might be. You might know like 3 people that would be effective. It would depend on the person you're talking to, how much they've read, and their background. But I would think for most Americans, honestly, getting them to think a long time about a hard problem is difficult already. And so, you know what I'm saying? It's like if you can't fit it into the now longer tweet than we used to have, if you can't fit it into that, people aren't going to pay attention, right? I mean, that's the sort of the mantra of journalism. It's got to fit into a short little sentence or a short little blurb of video. So getting them to pay attention to a complicated argument for which there's counter arguments and stuff, that's not maybe the most effective way. So I think that apologetics is not bad. I'm not saying bad apologetics, but that it may not be the effective way that we need to reach our culture as missionaries. And I also think that especially among mainline Protestants, it's been sort of, well, faith is not involved in that anyway. I mean, faith is about loving Jesus. It's about trusting God. It's not about arguments for or against God. We don't have a cat in this fight, right? We don't have any skin in this game. Why are we even involved in talking about with new atheism? Let's just believe. If we believe in Jesus and believe the gospel, then, we live good life and work for justice and peace, then that will be attractive by itself. And I think that that's probably also, it's not that it's bad in and of itself any more than apologetics is. I'm just not sure that it's truly effective. Because we need to have some message here too. Not just the message of forgiveness of sins, which of course is the common, most important message, but also a message about science and technology. That we can respond to those who have this sort of knee-jerk, quick reaction to what for us is something worth dying for. We need to have some kind of a response that takes it seriously, but without taking it ultimate as if it was an ultimate thing. Science is not an ultimate thing. Well, let's look at some of the figures here, and I'm just going to introduce them, and you can learn a lot more about them. It's very easy to learn about these people. Their stuff is all over the internet. It doesn't take you long. But I just want to give you an idea of who they are and who the most important academic voices are, because it's also very easy to go to some blog and go down some rabbit hole with someone. These is only that person's ideas. I mean, this person is not an expert. They're not a scholar. They're not trained. And so just to know that these are the major voices in what they think. So Daniel Dennett is a trained philosopher, and in his book, Breaking the Spell, his argument is, you know, we need to finally get around to studying religion scientifically. And for him, he thinks the sciences are basically the natural sciences. I think that's a prejudice that I don't agree with. But so he says, well, let's understand religion biologically, okay? So that's how we're going to understand religion scientifically. And one of the things he thinks is that toleration is not always right. You shouldn't always tolerate other religions. Behind that is the view that religion is dangerous. You see how that works? You don't tolerate things that are harmful to others in your society, right? That's where toleration ends. So his argument is, we shouldn't tolerate religious beliefs. Why not? Because they're dangerous, they're harmful, they're a virus, they're destroying society. So let's get rid of religion, let's stop tolerating religion. That's absolutely what he openly believes. Another one is we need to be critical of faith on moral grounds and on rational grounds, and stop trying to protect faith from rational criticism. That's unscientific, irrational, and dangerous. So what he's trying to break the spell is he says, it's like there's this magic spell around religion and faith. We're not going to think hard about it. Of course, that's not true. But he would have to actually go to a religious studies department to find out that that's not true. We've been studying religion scientifically for over 100 years. The whole idea of religious studies started out as Religionswissenschaft, the science of religion. It's not a new idea. It's very strange that someone so learned would not realize that this has already been happening for a very long time. So on the one hand, I'm kind of shocked by the naivete of this. But on the other hand, I kind of think, you know what? They don't care about what the 400 religion scholars in America think. They want to go after 400,000 Americans who don't realize that this has been going on. So that their audience is broad, and that's how they can almost get away with this kind of thing. And again, you can see that he hasn't studied what the scholars of religion think, because he defines religion as belief in supernatural agents. Well, you don't have Religion 101 in college. You learn that there's lots of different religions, and many of them don't have anything that's supernatural. I mean, for a while, when I was going through my sort of how do we make sense of the universe phase, which now that I know all the answers, I've stopped being like that. I was a Taoist, right? So in Taoism, there is no supernatural at all. I mean, and Taoism, perfectly legitimate religion, okay? You don't tell me that it's not. So the definition of religion is actually unscientific. And then faith is Daniel tries to squish it into a mold of either you can prove the beliefs of faith scientifically, empirically, like the natural sciences, or else they're irrational, And I want to look at it and say, you can't even prove that your beloved loves you on the grounds of natural science. I mean, there's loads of things you believe that you can't prove that way. Why is it irrational to believe things on good evidence, maybe, but just not on the scientific method? I mean, I don't get it. So on the other hand, I think, having said that about Dennett's approach, and he's the most, shall I say, mildest one. He's the one of the three we're talking about that doesn't make as many extreme rhetorical statements. And as a result, of course, he's not nearly as well known, right? He doesn't sell as much airtime as the others do. But I think he is right that religion is a natural, normal, typical thing that you find throughout human societies. That seems to me right. But it doesn't mean, though, that atheists are abnormal. It just means They're not typical. But then if you're an atheist, you already know that, right? You already know that your belief is not exactly the common one that everyone else around you holds. So there's nothing surprising there. It's just a sociological fact. And now we also believe in the cognitive sciences. It's a natural, typical developmental result that people believe in gods and supernatural agents. We should study scientifically in the social science. I think that you can give a very good, empirically grounded arguments about the social and psychological functions of religious faith, like Freud did, for example, another person who 100 years ago was trying to understand religion scientifically. This is not a new thing. Biological explanations of religion in terms of evolution are always highly speculative. And why? There's no evidence. You can't actually prove empirically that there's a biological evolutionary function to religious belief. You can assume it. You can try to interpret the data that way. You can't show it to be the case in any natural scientific way. So I also find it interesting that if you take the understanding of rationality and you apply it to what Dan actually says, he's incoherent. He's as irrational as he says the faithful believers are. And I was like, dude, you're better than that. What's going on? So yeah, there are people who are trying to, there is a whole area of evolutionary religious psychology and so forth, evolutionary morality, right? But what they do is they discover things that look like religion through paleoanthropology, and then they interpret them through a prior existing evolutionary worldview. But that's not empirical evidence. It doesn't show that religion has any survivable capacity. In fact, if you really believed that religion was dangerous, that faith was a virus, then it would be anti-evolutionary to be religious. Religious people would die out, right? I mean, it's actually the whole worldview of new atheism, it turns out, is incoherent and unscientific and irrational. Other than that, it's fine, right? It's just, I was like, how is it that this is making such a big splash? But oh well. You know, people like My Little Pony too. What can you do? Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. You know, it's perfectly fine. Ponies are great. Okay. So how about Richard Dawkins? And we're going up the scale of rhetoric when we go to Richard Dawkins is by far the most famous. He is also the one that's been on television. He has 2 television series. You can watch them all on YouTube, of course. He's got a position of, you know, the public understanding of science at Oxford. He's a really well-established biologist. I mean, he invented the idea of the selfish gene. I mean, he's really a brilliant scientist and a wonderful popularizer of scientific ideas. I have no problem with his writings on biology. It's when he gets to religion and philosophy that I think he's getting a little outside of his area of what he really knows about. And he just outright attacks all religion as dangerous and irrational. I mean, that's just his whole program, is that religion is bad. It's dangerous, it's irrational. Faith is just, he defines faith as believing something without any evidence, right? Now, look at the word evidence there. I mean, any evidence at all. Like, I believe this morning I had cereal for breakfast. You know, can I prove that to you scientifically? Well, no, I digested it. I went to the smallest room before I came here. It's gone. There's no evidence that I had cereal for breakfast. There isn't any. But I'm just going by the evidence of my memory, right? So, but for me, that's good evidence. But it's not public, it's not scientific, it's not. So he's playing on this word evidence because when you ask him what kind of evidence counts for you for belief in God, he's going to go back to things like biology, physics, chemistry. If you can't show it like that, then you can't show it at all. But of course, there's loads of things in life that if you couldn't show them scientifically, you wouldn't believe them at all. But it's perfectly rational to believe them. And again, it comes back to the limits of science and their focus. So the other thing about Dawkins that you don't see in Dennett and less in Harris is, Dawkins is actually one of these very erudite British scholars, right? His lovely Oxford accent. And of course, he went to English public school. Well, in public schools, back when he was going, you would still learn things like the Bible. They'd still have like an Anglican chapel and stuff that the students all came to, or regularly came to, as sort of the done thing, You could skip out if you wanted to, but even if you didn't believe in God. So he's heard Bible stories in chapel, and he's probably studied the Bible some. But his reading of the Bible, oh my gosh, his reading of the Bible, it's like biblical studies never existed. And honestly, it's something else. But he's highly critical of the Bible. In fact, there's someone I went to Oxford with, Catherine Dell, who's now a professor of Old Testament at that other place. It starts with a C. I can't remember the name of it. Oh, Cambridge, that's it. She wrote a book on how to, how shall we read the Old Testament? How shall Christians read the Old Testament? And it's all about responding to Dawkins and the New Atheist criticism of the Old Testament from a Christian point of view. It's really a very good book. But the fact that they haven't bothered to actually study what biblical scholars have been trying to say in the science of biblical criticism, which is what they used to call it, is again, it's like, I don't know, it's just surprising that they don't actually show that they've read these in the book. Maybe they've read hundreds of books. Maybe they've memorized S.R. Driver's commentary on Deuteronomy. I don't know, but if you read their books and what they say, it looks like they haven't bothered to study biblical studies. Dawkins defines religion basically as monotheism. And again, this is a very limited understanding of God. Faith is either scientific or it's irrational. It's the same false dilemma that we see all the time. He actually does go to the trouble of reviewing arguments for the existence of God. But despite the fact that the world's greatest expert in arguments for the existence of God today works at Oxford University and has written 6 or 7 major books on the topic, all he talks about are really old arguments from people like Thomas Aquinas. Now, I mean, Aquinas was great in the Middle Ages, but the scientific understanding he draws on is way out of date. So it's easy to knock him, easy to knock that stuff aside. But at least I will give you this to Dawkins. He pays attention to the fact that Christians have been saying, okay, I may not believe in God because of arguments, but I can give you some arguments of why it's rational to believe in God. It's the whole position of St. Anselm and Augustine too, but that, first we start with faith, and from faith then we can seek greater understanding, and we learn more, we have greater insight on the basis of faith, and we can show why our belief is reasonable. So one thing he says, though, that shows he hasn't done maybe enough reading in philosophy of religion, is he thinks that because God knows a lot of stuff, then God is very complex. And it's almost like he thinks that God has a physical brain. And so for every thought God has, there's some brain state that God must have. And so to have an infinite amount means you have this very complex brain or something. The idea that God might be a spirit, that God might be the eternal mind, a person without a body or a brain, it's not on his horizon. And so, I'm sorry, but a propositional truth is not a thing. And the fact that you believe more thoughts now than you did yesterday doesn't make you any more complex than you were yesterday. It's this really simple thing. If you thought more about theology, you would know that this is not a problem. God isn't more complex because God knows everything. It's a basic mistake. I don't know how else to put it. And his reading of the Bible is like proof texting, literalistic. It's something else. I mean, it's almost like he's going to read the Bible the same way as the people he interviews and makes fun of in his shows. He's very conservative, sort of literalistic, biblistic people. He reads the Bible the same way and then dismisses it. Well, it's easy to dismiss the Bible if you read it that way. So, It's a little disappointing. On the other hand, the thing I will say this, if you watch them on YouTube or on television, you listen to the podcast, you read their books, it becomes very persuasive. It's like you start feeling like this makes a lot of sense. Of course, this is the scientific way. I don't need religion. Religion is deluding. It's irrational. It kind of like gets you in, and you start thinking that way. To critically evaluate it takes energy and thought, independent of what you're reading. And it becomes persuasive, is what I'm saying. It could become very persuasive. But at the same time, when you do think about it critically, and you do know things like biblical criticism, philosophy, and theology, then it's pretty obvious that what they're attacking is just a straw man. It's an easily knocked down argument. It's a logical fallacy. Okay, so let's look at Sam Harris then. He is the most strident in his claims against religion, right? And he pits faith completely against religion. It's almost like he thinks to believe, to have faith, is automatically to be irrational. So he always sees religion as harmful. And when it's been pointed out, for example, that more people died under atheist nations in the 20th century than all the people that were ever killed in the whole history of the church by the church. Actually, they were killed by the state, but under the approval of the church. Way more people died under Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, official atheists. And Harris's response to that is, well, that's because communism is a state religion. Honestly, you're just like, that's not going to work, But and yet people, you will see that same response parroted by hundreds and thousands of other people on the internet. Communism is just a state religion. That's why it's dangerous. In other words, to be a dangerous organization is automatically to be religious. And to be a religion is automatically dangerous. That's this kind of simplistic identification. Unbelievable. So, yeah, communism is a state religion. You just go, no, that's not possible. I'm not going to believe that. Well, how shall we respond to Harris? Well, I think one is to point out that Christian theology works on this model of, maybe you believe things that you can't absolutely prove, but then on the basis of having that faith, you can come to understand and know and find new evidence that you might not have seen before. William James has this famous example. It's kind of like making a friend, If you come with someone and you believe they're friendly and you believe you're going to be friends, you act a different way. You have a different attitude. Your perspective is different on that person, and it might then leads to being friendly, right? But if you came with a different attitude to the same person in the same context, it can lead to a very different history where you were suspicious, you were anxious, you thought that they were dangerous, and so you never became friends. Neither one is provable before you actually meet the person, right? It's a basis of your sort of understanding of the world. But how you believe can sometimes affect the history of what comes to be real and what you come to know. And I think faith in God will affect how you read and understand the universe. And that's not irrational. That's perfectly human and perfectly rational. Because one kind of thing you accept as truth is bound to influence how you discover new truth. It's the way we work. So religion is open to rational criticism. I can't imagine why Dennett and Harris think that it isn't. I mean, don't they realize we've been doing this for 200-300 years, subjecting? Haven't they ever heard of, the quest for the historical Jesus? How could you really not know any of that stuff, or just pretend that they don't know? I don't know which it is. I can't figure it out. But religious people have founded universities, hospitals, peace movements. You read these books and you think that those things never happened. It's just very strange to me. Anyway, so, yeah. Now, let's talk about a few more things maybe about Harris. So he tries to explain evils. What they ignore The most glaring thing they ignore, besides the atheist regimes who have oppressed and killed their own people in the 20th century, the other thing they ignore is the fact that science and technology can be used by evil people for evil ends. Why can't I think about religion the same way? Yeah, religion's powerful. Yeah, faith in God is powerful, but it can be used by evil people for evil ends. And why couldn't I say in science and technology are just like that? It seems to me that that's a reasonable parallel. That you can use technology to do horrible, awful things to destroy other people and the earth. Or you can use it to help people and heal the damage we've done to the earth. And religious, faith and spirituality are like that too. That seems so common sense to me. But maybe it's because I'm a believer. That I find it hard to see how you can just totally ignore the fact that science and technology have been used for evil ends like that. But there are things that they get right, and maybe this is the most important thing for us to think about today is what do they get right that we should agree with in our conversation with this alternative philosophy of life, okay? And what they get right is that Christian religion really has been, as an organized human institution, the cause of oppression, misunderstanding, and violence. That's true. I mean, it's just true. And we're standing here at Luther Seminary. It's because the church is full of sinners. Hello? I mean, it's what every Lutheran should think. If they don't think it, they should think it. I'm not Lutheran, though, so I don't think it. No, actually, okay, I think it too. No, yeah, the church is full of sinners, and it is powerful. It is a powerful, powerful thing, this gospel, this belief in God, this organization that we call the church that's drawn together by our affection and love and worship of Jesus Christ. Yeah, sure. It has caused these things. And so maybe the first response to the new atheism ought to be public repentance of the past. Maybe John Paul II was right to just publicly forgive Galileo. To say, we made a mistake. That was an error. His interpretation of the Bible, while we didn't agree with it, it wasn't heretical. Of course, that was the key point, right? The key point was not he wanted to do science. Heck, they did science at the Jesuit observatory down the street in Rome. But that he wanted to interpret the Bible in keeping with his new discoveries. And that's where they said, no, you as an individual don't get to interpret the Bible. Forgive Galileo and recognize that was a mistake. Repent of the things that we have done wrong. And there's been some of that. And I think making that known, making the fact that the ELCAs repented of the condemnations of Anabaptists and Turks or whatever in their confessions. I mean, make this known, make it available. Yeah, we agree with you that evil things have happened in the name of God. And we are sorry, and we're repenting of those things. Another thing is that faithful believers are too anti-intellectual in America. I don't think that's true around the whole world. But America has this kind of populist anti-intellectualism that many Christians have absorbed through the revivalist movements of the 19th century and everything. And so we're still stuck with that. So it's like we don't want to engage these things on an intellectual basis. We don't want to learn to think hard and critically about the Bible and our own faith. That's not something we want. What we want is absolute certainty and safety from all critical intellectual attack. And I think the church, we've got to get over that. We've got to get over that. If we're going to respond to these critics, we've got to get over trying to protect ourselves and the scriptures and the God we believe in from all intellectual criticism. That's going to get us nowhere. We're going to lose this fight if we do that. The sciences really are important, and they deserve to be engaged in the church. In our teaching, in our preaching, in the way we live, we need to engage the science and current technological concerns like ecological crisis. That's something that we can learn, and that's an improvement that we could make as religious people. So there are things that we can learn from scientism. I think we need to talk more about what we mean by faith in terms of reason. Yes, it's radical trust in God. Of course, that's what faith ultimately is. But there's also things that we believe because we believe in God. And those things should be open to exploration and criticism and discussion. So that to learn to be able to articulate in a quick way what is our understanding of faith and how does it relate to things like science in specifically and reason more generally. Because our mission is to a scientific and technological age. I went backwards. But what about evidence? Maybe we should think a little bit about evidence too. Well, before I get to the questions about evidence, and I do want to get there, I want to stay in this moment of reflecting with you. How can we better live our Christian faith in a way that will engage this movement in our culture and make the gospel more winsome for them? So another one, I think, is that we are willing to have a dialogue, that we take the conversations, the views of people we encounter seriously as a legitimate, alternative, meaningful way of life, and to recognize that there's much that we can and should learn from them. You might say that I said listening is the first act, and I also think that love needs to be the first act. That it is in actually loving and having relationships with people that we are going to make connections with those outside of the Christian faith. And if they start to think that, well, I'm not really a person, I'm just some project, you're trying to check me off some box of books of people you talk to Jesus about or something, that's not going to be all effective, and it's really a little dehumanizing, to be frank. But if you treat them as real people, and you love them, you keep coming back to them even when they say things that are very, anti-religious when they find out you're a believer, then you're going to have a better chance of connecting with them, I think, in the long run. So relationships really matter. It's sort of not only faith-seeking understanding, it's love-seeking conversation. I think that's going to be a very important mode of engaging people who passionately accept and preach and believe this alternative worldview. So relationships matter. But I think, too, so do arguments. Let's see if I can get to that again. Arguments and reason matter, too, as I'll talk about a little. So I think we need to embrace and maybe more fully engage with adults in our churches than we have. The fact that we do have an open, critical acceptance of the Bible as a historical human book. So to accept the biblical criticism, to accept scientific biblical criticism, to use it, to openly engage it. I know I've been a pastor, still am, right? This is not an easy thing to talk about in church because you're always worried. There's so many other things that might go wrong with a sermon. Why would I mention this too? And then open myself up. I don't want to be shaking hands and says, man, that is an evil heresy. What do you mean Moses didn't write the book of Genesis? I can't believe you said that, Pastor. I mean, to say things like that, you kind of open yourself up to that. But I think as a community of Christ in the culture we're in right now, we need to all learn a little bit more about that so that we can accept what the scientific biblical studies have been telling us about the human side of Scripture. And to be able to say, yeah, it has a human side. Yeah, there's texts of terror in it. Yeah, there's old scientific ideas, old natural philosophies that we don't buy into anymore. But it's still true, and it's still the Word of God for us today. And to live into that nuanced perspective, which is hard. I'm not saying it's easy. It's very hard to put into like one tweet, exactly what all that is. But I mean, to try to make that better known would be very helpful, I think. And another one is to teach the centrality of Jesus for understanding Scripture. That we don't know one part of the Bible by itself is authoritative, right? So that we have to avoid literalism and what I call atomism. One single verse of the Bible is not going to be authoritative for the church. So someone like Dawkins goes to find, 3 verses that he doesn't like in the Pentateuch or something like that. See what an evil, awful God the God of Israel is. He said, well, we recognize that there are parts of the Bible that are not authoritative and that we're not going to follow. And yet we still say the Bible as a whole is the Word of God, because Jesus is for us the center of that and the criterion by which we understand it. All right. So I've been talking mostly about the new atheists and how we might respond to them, how we might talk to them. So I want to conclude my talk today with just a few remarks on some areas where we might independently want to learn and think and reflect more just on our own that have to do with this debate. And one has to do with you might say, philosophy, and the other has to do more with science and theology. So it turns out that, as a matter of fact, while all this has been going on, and indeed even before, back in about the 70s and 80s, there's been an amazing flowering of philosophy of religion in the academic world, in the English-speaking world. An incredible flowering. So that now the arguments for the existence of God are on a better rational basis than they've probably been in 200 years. So that, this is the wrong slide. You want to go back. So that Richard Swinburne, right, at Oxford is probably, is the world's greatest living authority on arguments for the existence of God. He's written, 6 or 7 major books, and what he does is he just takes some of the arguments that we typically learn about, maybe in, like the design argument, right, or the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And he gives them a highly complicated, complex, abstract basis in formal logic, modal logic, probability theory, and drawing on the latest discoveries in science. And he says, physics and astronomy are very, very friendly to faith. They are. And there's nothing, and he shows that these arguments still have power, rational power today. Not to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt, but to give evidence that that monotheism is a reasonable belief in a scientific age. It's not the only way to explain the universe, but it is a reasonable, rational way to explain the universe. And of course, you can't prove Christianity is true, but you can show that monotheism is very likely a rational way of understanding the universe as we know it right now. I'm not talking about the God of the gaps here, right? I'm not talking about finding some little space in science that science itself has not empirically understood and giving another kind of empirical explanation. I'm talking about a God who works at the foundation of reality itself, that all the sciences presuppose. So another figure is not as well known worldwide, but Robert Spitzer in America has actually a really interesting series of new, he calls them new proofs for the existence of God. But that's because he's a Jesuit priest and a philosopher and theologian, former president of Gonzaga University. So he's thinking in terms of St. Thomas, the proofs that Thomas gives. And he's updating them in new ways. He did a doctorate in philosophy of science at the Catholic University of America. And he has some very persuasive and interesting. He's especially spent a long, long time, he has a background in physics, in understanding Big Bang cosmologies and all of its different models. So one thing that he argues, and this is philosophy of physics, this is metaphysics, right? It's not physics, but he points that no matter which of the prominent models of Big Bang cosmology you accept, there's a finite amount of time between right now and the beginning of everything, this initial singularity. In all the models, that is true. And that means that the universe is contingent, that it has a beginning. Whatever you want to describe that beginning, even if you think space and time break down at the very moment of the singularity, that still is a beginning. And it's a beginning in the sense that there's a finite amount of measurable time between now and that event. And, that looks like you either just accept that reality just came to be like that, or, and again, remember this is metaphysics, thinking about physics, it's philosophy, or you believe that there's a God who created it. There's nothing irrational about believing there's a God who created it. There's nothing about the physics that demands that conclusion either, but it's perfectly reasonable. Or one thing that Swinburne talks a lot about is the fact that in physics, we keep and chemistry too, biology also to some extent. We keep talking about the laws of nature, right? So you try to get down to the most basic part of energy or matter, because physics studies matter and energy. And you get way, way down there, and you think, okay, it's either going to be energy itself or it's going to be some particle, some matter. And at the most basic quantum level, it looks like right now, however fundamental you get down to it, particles can't really exist without quantum fields, right? But some philosophers have also pointed out that actually quantum fields couldn't exist without particles either. Although that's not the way that many quantum theorists usually think. But as a matter of fact, quantum fields can be understood as the potential exchange of virtual particles. So maybe it works both ways. In other words, you're getting down to the fundamental levels. And if you ask the metaphysical question, well, where do the fields come from and the particles come from? And why do they endure with the properties they have over time? So that the same fundamental reality now was there 100 years ago, and it's the same fundamental reality on the other side of our galaxy as it is now. Why is that? And in physics, the answer is that's just the way it is. There's no empirical answer to that question. There can't be, because you're at the bottom of what empirical reality is. It's just the way it is. It's just law of nature. It's just the way things are. So, but of course, it's rational to believe that there's a God who, not just in the beginning, but every second, holds the universe together by giving laws of nature, and that if God stopped acting on the universe, everything would fall back into the nothingness out of which God holds it moment by moment. That's perfectly rational. It's perfectly scientific. There's nothing weird about that. So I'm just saying, there are good, how do I want to put these, signs of transcendence in the science as we know it now. Now you might say to me, well, 100 years from now, science will be different. Maybe we'll have come up with a grand unified theory that explains some of the constants that we're now noticing about the fine-tuning character of the universe. Well, sure. But, arguments like this are based upon what we know now about the world. And of course, they have to change. That's why Aquinas is easy to criticize, but Swinburne's a lot more persuasive. The other thing I think, though, that's interesting to me, too, is to show how, in many areas of contemporary science, we can show how scientific belief and theological belief are compatible with each other in wonderful ways. I'm going to end here with this. And I found fascinating, as I've come to study neuroscience more and more in the cognitive sciences, that actually, if you get past Christian tradition, which has thought of the soul as this immortal thing, kind of like Plato or whatever, and went back to what the Bible actually says about souls and bodies, that the soul and body in Scripture there's this holistic understanding of human being. The soul is not immortal in the Bible. The Bible doesn't teach the soul is immortal, or it's a completely separate thing. It does talk about the soul, and it talks about body parts, of course. But, for example, in the story of the creation in Genesis 2, right, God makes the body first, and there's just a breath of God that makes the human being a living thing, which is how you could understand the word soul in Hebrew, is just anything that moves and is alive has a soul, has breath. So that seems to fit, I think, a lot better with what we're discovering about the mind and the soul, what we call mind and soul, which, by the way, I think the mind is simply the whole human being thinking, and the soul is just the whole human being praying and worshiping. I don't actually think there are like separate parts of you that we call mind and soul. But there's an understanding of the mind that's being called the emergent mind, or the emergent soul, so that the mind and soul can't be reduced down just to body parts, but they emerge out of a whole living human being. So that you're not just your brain, which is the way some neuroscientists think, but the whole of you is like integrated into one ontological reality. And I find this emergent idea very much in keeping with the sciences. So it's to me exciting that we can actually go back and reread Scripture in the light of modern science and find new truth there that we didn't realize before. Well, so I think I've come to an end here. And basically my big point is, I guess, that as easy as it might be to say, well, these people don't know anything about biblical criticism, or these people don't know anything about academic theology, even though it's thousands of years old, going back to Origen of Alexandria, they just, I don't think we should dismiss them. I don't think we should ignore them, but we should engage them in the name of the gospel. So thank you.